Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. Today we are looking at the horrifying case of Sherri Rasmussen from California, which took place back in 1986. A case that would take 23 years to solve and rely on revolutionary breakthroughs in forensic science in order for the perpetrator to finally be brought to account. Sherri was born on the 7th of February 1957. She was one of 3 daughters born to Nels and Loretta Rasmussen. In the winter of 1985, 29-year-old Sherri married John Rutten. The couple lived together in a gated complex on Balboa Boulevard in Van Nuys, California. John worked as an engineer and Sherri was the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. She had a successful career in critical care nursing and also provided presentations and taught classes for fellow nurses. Sherri had always been very intelligent, skipping ahead 2 grades in school, and was described as being a kind, loving and driven individual. On the evening of the 24th of February 1986, John returned home from work just before 6 p.m. As soon as he arrived, he felt that something was wrong. Sherri had called in sick to work that morning, and yet their garage door was open. The previous year, he had bought Sherri a silver 2-door BMW as an engagement gift, and this was no longer in the garage. John knew that Sherri was unwell, and as such was surprised to see that the car was missing. When John entered their home, he was greeted by a horrifying scene. The house had been ransacked, and in amongst the chaos, sprawled on the living room floor, was Sherri. She had been badly beaten and shot multiple times. Sherri, who was athletic and stood 6 foot tall, had put up a ferocious fight with her attacker. It was established that the attack had begun in the dining room, where a blood trail and a bloody handprint indicated that Sherri was trying to escape or to reach the panic button on the alarm console. However, before she could do so, the attack continued in the living room. During the altercation, Sherri was bitten on the left forearm and was then incapacitated after being struck over the head with a heavy vase. The attacker had then grabbed a quilt, presumably to help muffle any noise, and shot Sherri dead. A post-mortem revealed that Sherri had sustained 3 shots to the chest that pierced her heart, lungs and spine. The lead homicide detective, Lyle Mayer, tried to piece together the events of that day. A housekeeper in the house next door recalled hearing a scuffle and a scream, but, believing it to be a domestic issue, did not report this to the police. This housekeeper did not recall hearing any gunshots. The working theory was that a burglary had gone very wrong. With Sherri having taken a sick day from work, it was assumed that a burglar may have been unaware of her presence, and the killer made their escape in Sherri's BMW. Several valuable items had been left behind, hinting at a rushed exit. Together with her car, the only other item that was missing was John and Sherri's marriage certificate. Lloyd Mahoney from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office checked Sherri's body for trace evidence, but after looking, nothing of note was found. The bite mark on Sherri's arm was swabbed and later booked into evidence, but back in 1986, this provided little in the way of clues. Sherri's parents arrived in Los Angeles from Arizona the following day. They spoke to the lead detective, Lyle Mayer, who confirmed that Sherri's husband, John, had been ruled out as a suspect, and then explained that they were looking for 1 or more burglars in connection with Sherri's murder. Her father, Nels, brought it to the attention of the detective that Sherri had been complaining about one of John's ex-girlfriends, who had been confrontational towards her. This woman had showed up at Sherri's work a month or 2 earlier, and although Nels did not know her name, he knew that she worked for the Los Angeles Police Department. Whilst Nels believed that this woman should be a prime suspect, the police believed that the burglary theory was far more credible. Sherri's car was found abandoned about a week after her murder, but unfortunately did not yield any additional information to move the investigation forward. Then, 2 months after the murder, the police believed that they had finally caught a break. 2 men attempted a burglary a few blocks from where Sherri and John lived. One of them had been brandishing a gun, so locating these 2 men became the prime focus of this investigation. Photo-fit pictures were circulated, but the men could not be found. Months passed and the case went cold. A $10,000 reward was offered by Sherri's parents in the hope of tracking down their daughter's murderer. Her parents did everything they could to keep the case alive. In November 1987, they held a press conference and reiterated the offer of a reward. Whilst John originally mentioned his ex-girlfriend to the police, as time went by he gradually faded out of sight, leaving Sherri's parents to become her advocate. The following year, Nels wrote a letter to the then Chief of Police, Darrell Gates. He requested that he look into the case, and more specifically John's police officer ex-girlfriend. Nels did not receive a reply. Nels also reiterated his theory regarding John's ex-girlfriend to the detectives involved in the investigation and was told that he watched too much television. Nevertheless, her parents continued to push for answers. Sherri's mother, Loretta, regularly called the Van Nuys Police Department for updates on the case. In 1993, 7 years after Sherri's death, her parents travelled to Los Angeles to meet with one of the detectives who had inherited the case after Lyle Mayer retired. Lyle's successor informed Nels and Loretta that he had reviewed the original case notes and tried to advance the investigation, but the prospect of generating any new leads was poor and that the police had been unable to identify any suspects. Over the following years, some steps forward were made, most notably that the bite mark on Sherri's arm had been made by a woman, but the level of cold cases being investigated due to improvements in DNA technology led to significant delays in cases being reviewed. It would take a further 16 years for any significant progress to be made on Sherri's case. In 2009, now armed with the knowledge that the person responsible for the bite on Sherri's arm was female, the Van Nuys Homicide Department set about reviewing the case with fresh eyes, now taking into consideration the fact that her murderer was a woman. A list of 5 female suspects was drawn up. On that list was John's ex-girlfriend, Officer Stephanie Lazarus, who by now had been promoted to detective. The investigators on the Van Nuys squad vowed that Stephanie would be investigated discreetly, either to protect her good name should she have nothing to do with the murder, or to avoid tipping her off in the unlikely event that she did. 3 of the 5 suspects were quickly eliminated. Only Stephanie and a fellow nurse from the hospital remained. The detectives decided to investigate the nurse first. A DNA sample was collected. It came back negative. The police were now left with only one suspect, Detective Stephanie Lazarus. Could it really be that one of their own was responsible for this brutal, unsolved murder? They began to piece together Stephanie's history and her relationship to Sherri. It was established that Stephanie had met Sherri's husband, John, when they lived in the same dorm at UCLA. After graduating in the early 1980s, the pair had an on and off casual relationship over a period of a few years. In 1985, John met Sherri and their relationship became very serious, very quickly. He proposed to her in the summer, and by November of 1985 they were married. Just 3 months later, Sherri was dead. At that time, 26-year-old Stephanie was a patrol officer. She became a detective in 1993 and married a fellow police officer in 1996. They adopted a little girl, and in 2006 she was assigned to the Art Theft Department in Los Angeles Police Department. During her long career with the police department, she did not have any disciplinary issues. The investigation uncovered that 13 days after the murder, Stephanie had reported that one of her firearms, a .38 revolver, the same as the murder weapon, had been stolen. It felt as though the case was getting closer to being solved, but at this stage there was no definitive proof, just a string of coincidences. The police needed Stephanie's DNA. On May the 27th, 2009, A plainclothed detective trailed Stephanie as she was running errands. When Stephanie threw away a cup and straw, the surveillance team immediately recovered it from the rubbish. A DNA profile was extracted, and on May the 29th it was confirmed the DNA matched that retrieved from the bite on Sherri's arm 23 years earlier. A small group of detectives continued to work on the case, preparing for Stephanie's arrest. On June the 5th, 2009, under the initial guise of being interviewed for a stolen art case, Stephanie was interviewed about Sherri's murder. When it was mentioned during the interview that the police had DNA from the crime scene, Stephanie got up and left the interview room. She was immediately arrested in the hallway outside. She was taken to the LA County Jail and held on a $10 million bail. On June 8, 2009, she was charged with Sherri's murder, but she maintained her innocence. The case eventually went to trial in 2012 and lasted almost a month. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence and provided witnesses to back up their argument that Stephanie had killed Sherri due to her being jealous of Sherri's relationship with John. It came out at trial that John had had sex with Stephanie after his engagement and prior to his marriage to Sherri, which was foreclosure, something that he admitted was a big mistake. Whilst there was no indication that John was in any way involved with his wife's murder, Sherri was clearly concerned about Stephanie's behaviour and worried that her husband was still involved with her. Stephanie's defence team argued that the DNA evidence from the crime scene had been corrupted and was not reliable enough to lead to a guilty verdict. They also argued that the fact that Stephanie hadn't been investigated at the time of the murder meant that valuable evidence and testimony was not collected that could potentially have exonerated her. The jury deliberated for 3 days before finding Stephanie guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. An appeal in 2015 upheld this guilty verdict. Despite Sherri's parents consistently telling the police over the years about John's ex-girlfriend and their belief that she was involved in their daughter's murder, Stephanie was not investigated at the time. Close friends and neighbours were not interviewed as the police investigation centred around the burglary gone wrong theory. Some of the original investigators claimed that Stephanie had not been mentioned to them early on in the investigation, despite Nels constantly bringing this information to the police. It would take 20 years for him to be taken seriously about this. Sherri's parents brought a lawsuit against the city and the LAPD due to the way in which the case had been handled. They alleged that there had been misconduct and a cover-up in the investigation. They claimed that the LAPD had been hostile towards them from the day after the murder and also throughout the investigation of the case. They also further questioned why Stephanie, in her role as a police officer, had been allowed to periodically review the files of a case that she was known to have been linked to. This lawsuit was eventually declined on the basis of the statute of limitations having expired. In November 2023, Stephanie, now 63, appeared in front of the parole board for the first time. At this hearing, she finally admitted involvement in Sherri's death. However, she did not apologise to relatives and downplayed her crime, saying that she had never meant to kill Sherri. In December, it was reported that Stephanie was eligible for parole. The status as of the 4th of April 2024 is that the Governor referred the incarcerated person's parole grant for review by the full board. If this goes ahead, Stephanie will be released this summer, having served just 15 years for a crime for which she remained a free woman for 23 years. That concludes the story of the horrifying case of Sherri Rasmussen from California. So you may have noticed it was a shorter video for you this week. Just like to say thank you to all the people that have been sending me buy me a coffees and also for the super thanks. It really does help me and I so appreciate the help. Please also check out some of my longer videos that I have covered recently. Playing them ones all the way through are a great help. Okay, for those of you that are petty crimers, here are a couple of the viewers' pets. First up we have Justin Serial Miller from Thunder Bay, Ontario. He has sent in pictures of his basset hound, Violet. She is a recent rescue with serious crimes such as bed hogging, sticking her face into anything that's food related, and also really loves barking at strangers when on walks. Violet, you rock Justin's world. Next, from Alabama, Debbie gives us Jessie Rotten. She's nearly 10 years old and has over 16 petty crime convictions, including garbage can flipping, food larceny, squeaky toy demolition and destruction, late night barking, SBDs, silent but deadlies, and disorderly conduct at any Alabama football watch parties. Jessie Rotten, you are a cracker. There will be more petty crime as and when I get time to cover these. In the meantime, thank you for watching the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. With Sherri's case, there was a 48 hours episode covering this story. It was called One of Their Own. Season 23, episode 32. Goodbye.